Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about the mechanisms of evolution. Natural selection, this is the struggle to survive. Individuals with characteristics are well suited to their environment, and those that are not will either die or leave few offspring. This is also known as descent with modification. Later on, this became known as survival of the fittest. So for example, here we have the peppered moths. Now they rested on the bark of oak trees back during the 19th century, and most moths blended in with the oak bark, which was a light brown with green specks. And then the post-industrial revolution, soot and pollution stained the tree bark dark brown. And so the population of the dark moths grew, and the light-colored moths population shrank. So here, pre-industrial England, you can see that uh, the bark was a very light color, and so the lighter peppered moths blended in, where the dark peppered moths stood out. So birds would more likely eat the dark peppered moths. Where during industrial England, the soot stained the wood blue, so those light peppered moths didn't no longer blended in, but the dark peppered moths did. So population genetics, this is an individual cannot evolve a new phenotype within its lifetime. So natural selection acts on a range of phenotypes in a population, and that population's genes will change over a period of time. So we're going to look at the gene pool, which is all the alleles in the population, and look at the allele frequency, which is the percentage of that specific allele population. And those populations in which the frequency of alleles remain the same is known at being genetic equilibrium. So they are at the same frequency. Genetic drift. This is the alteration of allelic frequencies due to chance events. Genetic drift can affect small populations that descend from a small number of organisms. So Darwin's organisms on the Galapagos, Amish families in Pennsylvania. So 1 in 14 have inherited the recessive allele for extra digits and short arms, compared to the 1 in 1,000 national average. Now, the founder effect is when a small population leaves the main area and moves to a new area, and so that small group are now the founders of that area. So it creates a genetic bottleneck, which means that only the traits that have moved over there are going to show up more often than the traits in, say, the larger area. Organisms of the same species are able to breed and produce fertile offspring, so therefore they share the same gene pool. So reproductive isolation, this is natural selection, can act separately on two groups if they're isolated. So they get separate gene pools, which means they're going to get different adaptations that can occur, which can end up leading us to two different species. For example, in the Grand Canyon, we have two different types of squirrels. They're two different species. Just one lives on the east of the Grand Canyon and one lives on the west. So, speciation using Darwin's finches, we have step one, the founding fathers and mothers, which means that they made their way from South America. And then the finches from island A crossed to island B, so the separation of populations. The change in the gene pool, so over time the populations adapted to the needs of their environment, and then they have reproductive isolation because the birds prefer to mate with birds that have the same beak as they do. So then we get two species that have evolved. And then step five, they share the same island, so they coexist. They either coexist, extinct, or further evolution. So one may outcompete the other and cause one to go into extinction, or they can coexist, as is what happened with many of the birds. Their beak morphology allowed them to coexist due to the fact that they ate different things. So different types of reproductive barriers or reproductive isolation. We have geographic barriers, which is rivers, mountains, islands. If we have a large lake and the middle dries up, we can now have two lakes, so we have a geographic barrier there. And so over time, those separate populations will become separate species. So we have stabilizing selection, which favors the average, reducing variation in a population. We have directional selection, which favors one of the extremes, disruptive selection, which favors both extremes, and the intermediate form is usually taken out, which leads to the evolution of two new species. So here we have different graphs. So here this is stabilizing selection. So the bell curve of generation 1 and then generation 2. So the middle is the middle trait is what is favored there. Disruptive, so generation 2, if you look, the middle is being taken away, taken out, and directional, which means that one of the extremes is favored. So evolution of a new species is called speciation. This occurs when members of similar populations no longer can interbreed to produce fertile offspring within their natural environment. Some physical barriers: lava from volcano eruptions, sea level changing, islands that are isolated. When species are geographically isolated, they can no longer interbreed and exchange genes, which allow for new species to be created. Gradualism is the idea that species originate through gradual change from adaptation, so the fossil evidence from camels show that it evolves slowly over time. Here we have an example of a hypothetical frog family, and it splits from this red frog, which is the common ancestor, slowly creating adaptations which made the yellow frog and on the left, and slow with adaptations which made the pink frog on the right. Punctuated equilibrium argues that speciation occurs quickly in rapid bursts with long periods of genetic equilibrium in between. So we get an abrupt change and then it equilibrates, which means there's no change, and then another abrupt change and then there's no change. So here, this explains the absence of intermediate fossils. So when a species evolves into an array of species to fit number of diverse habitats, the result is adaptive radiation. So the example is Darwin's finches. Adaptive radiation is a type of divergent evolution. So species that were once similar to an ancestral species diverge or become extinct. So here we have an example of adaptive radiation, which we have the ancestral mammal, and from there we get many different mammals. We have the giraffe, the cow, the leopard, and the armadillo. When distantly related organisms evolve similar traits, this is called convergent evolution. So this occurs when unrelated species occupy similar environments, and thus they are subjected to the same environmental pressures and share the pressures of natural selection. Here we have an example of an ancestral bird creating a falcon, because an ancestral mammal and a bat, and then an ancestral reptile and a pterodactyl. They all have the convergent evolution of wings and being able to fly. Another example of convergent evolution would be the dolphin that we have today and Nevada state fossil of the ichthyosaur. If you look at the bone structure and how they would technically look like an ichthyosaur and a dolphin look very similar. However, it is convergent evolution because a dinosaur and mammals are two totally different lines. So here we have a nice infographic of pretty much everything that we went over. We have DNA, which can lead to mutations. We can get changes in the genotype from those mutations, and those changes in the genotype lead to changes in the phenotype, what is expressed. And that creates a variability in populations or adaptations. So the fittest individuals will pass on their genes with selective pressures. And those changes in allele frequencies in the gene pool, which we can get many generations with selective pressures and create a new species, which will either lead us to evolution and the continued success in the environment, or extinction, which means that they are overwhelmed by their environmental pressures.